He thought he'd found the gap. The captain had spent days mapping American radar blind spots, timing patrol rotations, plotting the one route no one was watching. He killed his transponder. He moved in total darkness. His tanker carried oil worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and within 4 minutes of crossing into those waters, every weapons system on a nearby American destroyer locked onto his hull. What happened next took less than 20 minutes, but the consequences are still detonating across Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow right now. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a tanker getting turned around, it's the moment the world discovered the true limits of Chinese military power. And the answer should terrify everyone who assumed Beijing was ready to challenge America at sea. Before we get into exactly what happened on that water, you need to understand what was at stake the second those tankers made their move. China consumes over 10 million barrels of oil every single day. Almost every drop arrives by sea, and a staggering 40% of that supply passes through one narrow waterway, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, flanked by Iran on one side and the Arabian Peninsula on the other, the Strait of Hormuz. If you're new here, we cover the military, geopolitical, and economic stories that are actively reshaping the balance of global power. And we update our analysis every single day, because right now, events are moving faster than almost any outlet can track. Hit subscribe now so you don't walk into tomorrow's developments blind. Beijing understood for years that this strait was its single greatest vulnerability. A blockade there wouldn't just inconvenience China, it would strangle Chinese manufacturing, collapse supply chains, and generate the kind of internal economic pressure that threatens the Communist Party's grip on power. So Beijing built a workaround. It locked in Iran as its primary energy partner, buying sanctioned Iranian crude at steep discounts, pumping billions into Tehran's economy while feeding Chinese refineries cheap oil that gave Chinese factories a significant cost edge over global competitors. And then, Beijing assembled what intelligence analysts called the shadow fleet. Hundreds of tankers operating under falsified registrations, swapped flags, disabled transponders, ghost ships running sanctioned oil through channels just below the threshold of American enforcement. For years, the system held. Nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports flowed to China through this network. Tehran stayed solvent, Beijing stayed fueled, and both governments found it convenient to pretend the arrangement barely existed. If this is the kind of strategic analysis you've been searching for, subscribe right now. We break down what the headlines miss every single day. Then came April 13th, 2026. And what began that morning was not a reaction. It was the culmination of years of deliberate American strategic preparation. 3 carrier strike groups now anchor the United States' presence in and around this region. The USS Abraham Lincoln, operating at full combat readiness inside the Gulf. The USS Gerald R. Ford, positioned in the Mediterranean, capable of reaching the theater within hours. The USS George H.W. Bush closing in, its arrival imminent. When it arrives, America will have 3 full carrier strike groups simultaneously concentrated around a single waterway for the first time in the modern era. More than 15 surface warships. Submarines running silent beneath the surface. F-35C and FA-18 Super Hornet fighters holding continuous combat patrols over the strait and its approaches. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft scanning every square kilometer of water in real time, feeding live data to American command centers. MQ-4C Triton drones operating at extreme altitude, their sensors capable of reading the heat signature of a single vessel in complete darkness. 50,000 American military personnel integrated into a single surveillance and interdiction architecture operating above, across, and beneath that water. This is not a traditional blockade with chains across the surface. It is something far more total, a surveillance environment so complete and suffocating that attempting to pass through it uninvited is the military equivalent of walking into a room packed with searchlights and believing you cannot be seen. And into that architecture, 3 Chinese-linked tankers chose to test whether the wall was real. The vessel registered as the Rich Starry moved first. Approximately 250,000 barrels of Iran-linked cargo. Registered to a Shanghai-based shipping company, its captain chose a route hugging the coast of the United Arab Emirates, calculating that the density of commercial traffic there would generate enough radar clutter to create confusion in American targeting systems. He ran dark, no transponder, no signal. Moving through the deepest hours of the night. For a brief window it appeared to be working. The Rich Starry entered the outer approaches of the Gulf of Oman. In those minutes, the captain may genuinely have believed he had threaded the needle. He had not. The USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, had been tracking the Rich Starry since it left Iranian waters. Every course correction, every speed adjustment, every navigational decision the captain thought he was making in secret. The warning that came over maritime radio frequencies was not a request. It was not a diplomatic signal. It was an order delivered by a warship with active weapon systems in the language navies use when they intend it to be the last warning they give. The rich Starry reversed course within minutes, its massive hull turning in the dark water, retreating toward Iranian shores. Two additional tankers, identified as the Austria and at least one other China-linked vessel, attempted the passage in rapid succession. Different timing, different approach angles, same result. 3 tankers, 3 reversals. Not one barrel of Iranian oil cleared the strait. Now here is where this story becomes something no government press release will tell you cleanly. China's defense minister, Admiral Dong Jun, stepped to a podium and issued a statement designed to project authority across the world. China had agreements with Iran. Chinese ships had every legal right to transit the strait. The United States had no right to interfere. His tone was that of a nation that considers itself a peer competitor to the most powerful military on Earth. And then, every single ship turned around anyway. That distance between what Admiral Dong Jun said at a podium in Beijing and what Chinese ships actually did on open water is the most consequential strategic revelation to emerge from this entire crisis. Because it was not a private failure that could be managed through state media. It happened in the open ocean, tracked by satellite, recorded by military surveillance, visible to every intelligence agency and naval command on the planet. The world watched China declare it would defend its ships. The world watched China's ships retreat without a single Chinese warship anywhere near the horizon. Here is the reality Beijing's strategists are now confronting on their maps. China has one overseas military base, Djibouti, on the East African coast. It holds a limited contingent of frigates and support vessels built for peacetime operations and low-intensity engagements. It was not designed to confront 3 American carrier strike groups 10,000 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. The mathematics of projecting naval power across that distance against that concentration of American capability is not a close equation. It is not a question of whether Chinese ships are modern or crews well-trained. It is a question of logistics, air cover, force ratios, and the physics of sustaining combat operations at extreme range against an opponent that has been doing precisely this for 50 years. A Chinese warship attempting to force that blockade line would not be a confrontation. It would mark the most dangerous moment between 2 nuclear powers since 1962, when Soviet vessels approached the American naval blockade around Cuba, and the world held its breath across 13 days, wondering if the crisis would become something no one could stop. Military analysts reaching for that comparison are not exaggerating. The logic is structurally identical. 2 nuclear powers, a blockade line, a decision about whether to cross it, and consequences, if the answer is yes, that neither side could fully control. Beijing understands this, which is why Admiral Dong Jun gives speeches and Chinese warships stay exactly where they are. So China absorbs, it calculates, it waits, and while it waits, it is making sure others absorb damage alongside it. Beijing immediately suspended all gasoline and diesel exports after the blockade began, squeezing Japan and South Korea, 2 close American allies who depend heavily on Chinese refined fuel. It began purchasing American liquefied natural gas in accelerated volumes, reopening import channels that had been closed during the trade war, attempting to weave economic interdependence that might generate diplomatic leverage even as military pressure intensifies. China is also positioning itself as the indispensable energy supplier to Southeast Asian nations, scrambling to replace supply chains disrupted by the Hormuz closure, expanding regional influence from a position of shared crisis. China is bleeding, but it is engineering the bleeding so that its rivals bleed harder. And it is sitting on approximately 130 days of strategic petroleum reserves as the clock against which every other calculation is running. 130 days. That is Beijing's runway. That is the window inside which a diplomatic resolution must emerge, or China's posture shifts from patience to something far more dangerous. And desperation, in a nuclear-armed great power facing domestic legitimacy pressure, is the most volatile variable in modern geopolitics. While Beijing waits, the damage accumulating inside Iran is approaching structural irreversibility. Look at Karg Island today and compare it to 6 weeks ago. Karg processes roughly 90% of all Iranian oil exports. 6 weeks ago, it was the economic heart of the Iranian state. Tankers cycling continuously, pumps running without interruption, revenue flowing from those docks to fund soldier salaries, proxy networks, weapons procurement, and every mechanism by which Iran projects power beyond its own borders. Today, the storage tanks are full to capacity. Pressure in the pipelines behind them is reaching dangerous thresholds because the oil being extracted has nowhere to go. The tanker queues are gone. The docks are still. The cranes that once loaded millions of barrels onto Chinese supertankers are motionless. Karg Island, locked. Bandar Abbas, locked. Bandar Imam Khomeini, Asaluye, the Shadow Fleet's concealed sanctuary at Larak Island, all locked. $13 billion. That is the monthly revenue Iran is losing while this blockade holds. $13 billion that is not paying for the fuel subsidies that keep domestic stability intact, not funding the IRGC operations that sustain Iranian influence across the region, not purchasing the diplomatic positioning that gives Tehran a seat at tables it would otherwise never be invited to. And the pressure behind that number is not only economic, it is geological. Oil wells cannot be switched off and restarted cleanly. As storage fills and exports remain blocked, Iranian operators are approaching the threshold at which shutting in wells becomes unavoidable. Once that process begins, the damage to production capacity is not quickly reversed. Every additional week the blockade holds, Iran's oil infrastructure sustains structural harm that will require years and billions of dollars to repair even after the crisis ends. Iran spent 40 years building Hormuz into its most powerful strategic weapon, the threat of closure. The implied ability to strangle global energy supply and force the world into negotiations on Tehran's terms. It deployed that weapon. Oil prices surged. Europe entered a fuel crisis. Global shipping ground toward emergency protocols. The weapon functioned exactly as designed. America's response was not to plead for access. It was not to negotiate from a posture of dependence. It was to take that weapon, reverse it, and point it at the country that spent 4 decades constructing it. The strait is now open to every nation on Earth except one. Saudi tankers, Emirati tankers, Qatari tankers, moving freely under the protection of the American naval presence. Mines being cleared, safe corridors maintained. Global commerce continuing, Iran's ports sealed, Iran's oil immobile, Iran's monthly revenue at zero. The nation that made Hormuz into a threat has just discovered that the most devastating application of Hormuz as a weapon was the one America chose, not Tehran. Hormuz is no longer Iran's leverage, it is Iran's cage. Now look at the other side of this ledger, because while Iran bleeds and China absorbs, the United States is experiencing something that from a purely economic standpoint resembles a precisely engineered commercial windfall. The moment Iranian oil disappeared from global markets, a supply vacuum formed and prices moved upward with mechanical certainty. At that exact moment, American energy infrastructure mobilized to fill the space. Gulf Coast ports along Texas and Louisiana entered a period of historic commercial intensity. More than 70 very large crude carriers scheduled port entries for April alone. Houston, Corpus Christi, Port Arthur. Every facility with available capacity fully booked and operating continuously. Washington simultaneously achieved 2 objectives through a single naval deployment: denying energy access to its most consequential strategic rival, and capturing the market share created by the supply China can no longer reach. The financial return on that naval investment is significant. American oil exports are running at record volumes and record prices, precisely because the military operation that produced those prices is being funded by the American taxpayer rather than the American oil industry. The profit flows privately, the operational cost is shared publicly, the strategic advantage is total. This is not coincidence, this is architecture. And then there is Russia. When the blockade began, the expected move was that Moscow would intervene in support of Tehran. Russia and Iran share a strategic alignment against Western pressure. Russia has weapons, diplomatic infrastructure, and a permanent UN Security Council veto capable of complicating American operations in meaningful ways. The Kremlin issued statements of condemnation. It called for respect for international law. It broadcast solidarity with Iran across every available multilateral forum. And it sent no warships anywhere near Hormuz. Because the blockade was not a problem for Russia, it was a miracle. The supply shock drove global oil prices upward at precisely the moment the Russian economy was being crushed by the financial burden of the Ukraine war. Russian crude flowing through northern routes, completely immune to American interdiction at Hormuz, became dramatically more valuable almost overnight. Russian oil revenues doubled within a single month. The Kremlin secured an estimated $19 billion in additional income directly attributable to the chaos in the Persian Gulf. And simultaneously, China, desperate for supply alternatives at any price, turned north toward Moscow. Beijing began purchasing Russian crude in accelerating volumes under terms increasingly favorable to Russia because China's negotiating leverage in that exchange was precisely zero. China needed the oil, Russia had the oil. Russia set the price. Putin had executed the most elegant geopolitical maneuver of the entire crisis without taking a single visible action. He allowed his supposed ally to drown. He collected the profits from the rising water, and he locked the world's second-largest economy into an energy dependency with Russia that will shape the Eurasian power structure for a generation. The solidarity statements were genuine. The strategic calculation behind them was ruthless. Every barrel of Iranian oil that failed to reach China was a barrel Beijing would need to source from Moscow at a higher price. The arithmetic was clean. The execution was cold. There are no permanent alliances in geopolitics. There are only permanent interests. And Vladimir Putin just demonstrated that principle with a precision that would earn respect if the ally absorbing it were not being destroyed in the process. Three futures now exist, and only one of them ends quietly. The first is diplomacy. Iran returns to a negotiating framework under quiet but intensifying pressure from Beijing, pressure China cannot acknowledge publicly without admitting its own desperation, but which is building daily as strategic reserves drain and structural damage to Iranian oil fields accumulates. A nuclear framework is reached in language that allows the Iranian government to describe it as survival while conceding what Washington actually requires. The blockade lifts, the strait normalizes. This is the outcome the entire pressure architecture was designed to produce. Every element of the operation, the storage capacity clock, the 13 billion monthly hemorrhage, the geological damage to Iranian wells, the shadow fleet being systematically hunted across open ocean, was engineered to make the negotiating table the only exit that does not lead somewhere categorically worse. The second future is escalation. The Houthis reopen attacks on Red Sea shipping, threatening Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously with Hormuz. A China-linked convoy tests the blockade with quasi-military escort, generating a confrontation neither Beijing nor Washington designed for, and neither can fully contain once it begins. Israeli operations resume under the cover of the crisis. The conflict expands beyond every boundary any party originally intended. Oil prices breach levels that trigger a genuine global recession. This is the future no one planned for, and that becomes incrementally more likely with every day the diplomatic window stays closed. The third future grinds forward without resolution. The blockade holds but does not force Iran to the table on Washington's timeline. American logistical sustainability comes under pressure across months of sustained three-carrier deployment as maintenance cycles and personnel rotations reach their limits. Allied support remains thin, leaving Washington largely alone running the most consequential naval operation in a generation. China continues probing with sanctioned tankers, some clearing the corridor and slightly extending Tehran's runway. The crisis calcifies into a permanent condition rather than a crisis with a terminal point. This outcome damages every party, but it damages some parties significantly less than others. And the party it damages least is the one whose ships are not at Hormuz, whose oil is moving at record prices, and whose primary strategic competitor is being systematically weakened at no direct cost to itself. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days and ended because someone in Moscow looked at a naval blockade line, assessed the military reality behind it, and made the only rational calculation the situation permitted. In 2026, that same arithmetic is unfolding in different water, with different actors, different weapon systems, and stakes that have not yet fully revealed their ceiling. China's tankers reversed course. China's defense minister issued declarations that could not protect a single vessel. Beijing is calculating carefully and declining to force the line. That restraint is simultaneously the most strategically prudent decision China can make and the most consequential public acknowledgement of military limitation in its modern history as a global power. 130 days of petroleum reserves, $13 billion draining monthly from Iran, $19 billion flowing into Russia's war budget, American crude moving at record volume and price, 50,000 American military personnel holding the world's single most critical maritime choke point. These are not abstract variables. They are a countdown. And when the countdown reaches its terminal point, the decisions made in Beijing, Tehran, and Washington will determine whether this crisis generates a new framework for global order or produces something the international system cannot recover from cleanly. The strait is open. The cage is closed. The clock is running. And somewhere in the Indian Ocean tonight, another shadow tanker captain is running his calculations, looking for the gap, searching for the blind spot, waiting for the window. He has not yet learned what the others already know. There is no gap. There is no blind spot. There is no window dark enough. The United States Navy is tracking everything moving in those waters, and its response will come before the order to accelerate is even finished being given. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Which of the three futures do you believe happens first? Diplomacy, escalation, or a grinding standoff that reshapes the world slowly? The conversation in the comments on this one is going to be worth reading. If you are not subscribed yet and you found this breakdown genuinely useful, now is the right time. We publish this level of analysis every single day, and the next development in this story is already moving.